Never let a cat into your life. That was it. The final words of a revered monk, spoken not with desperation, not with fear, but with a strange, piercing clarity that silenced the entire room. His breath stopped just seconds later. No chant followed, no poetic last teaching. Just that one sentence, floating in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. His disciples stood in solemn formation, some weeping quietly, others frozen in silent prayer. But one among them, the youngest, didn't cry. He didn't even blink. He stood still, consumed by a single question that refused to leave him. A cat? This was supposed to be a sacred moment, a master's final message to the world. And that message was about a cat? He tried to understand. This was no ordinary monk. This was a man who had given up all worldly possessions, who had meditated in the forest for years, who had lived and breathed discipline, silence, and spiritual clarity. His entire life had been a message of detachment and mastery of the self. And yet, in the final seconds of that extraordinary life, he chose to speak about something so trivial, so strange, so completely out of character, that it left the young monk's mind in turmoil. Why a cat? What had it done to deserve a place in a final breath? That night, long after the chants had faded and the other monks had returned to their sleeping quarters, the young successor sat beneath the moonlit sky, wide awake. The stillness of the monastery, usually comforting, felt heavy, almost haunting. He closed his eyes, trying to remember everything about that moment. The way the master looked at him, the calmness in his tone, the weight behind those final words. They weren't casual. They weren't confused. They were deliberate. But what did they mean? Surely a lifetime of enlightenment couldn't have ended in a warning about a house pet. And yet the feeling in his chest told him this wasn't random. It was a message, one he wasn't yet wise enough to decode. He spent the next several days in silence, isolated even among his brothers. He meditated, hoping for clarity. He fasted, thinking it might sharpen his insight. He searched the scriptures for metaphors or symbols that could tie meaning to that one word, cat. But no answer came. Instead, the question grew louder, deeper, heavier. And then something even more unsettling began to rise in him. The realization that the master hadn't just been giving advice. He might have been confessing a failure. There had been a shadow in his voice, a quiet pain tucked beneath the calm. Regret. And if that was true, if a man as disciplined, as powerful, as spiritually clear as the master could be undone by something so small, then what hope did anyone else have? Days passed. The young monk barely spoke. The once vibrant corridors of the monastery felt colder, quieter. He still moved through the rituals, lighting incense, serving tea, bowing at the altar. But his mind was elsewhere, spinning in quiet desperation. It was then that an old monk, wrinkled, slow-moving, but deeply observant, finally approached him. He had been there all along, standing at the edge of every ceremony, silently watching the new successor crumble under the weight of a riddle no one else seemed to question. With a gentle hand on the young monk's shoulder, he spoke, not in lecture, but in truth. "You're not the first to be haunted by his last words," he said. "But you are the first who deserves to know the story behind them." His voice was soft, almost sorrowful. "Your master wasn't always the man you remember. Before peace came the fall, and it all began with a single indulgence." The young monk looked at him, startled. He had only known the master as a pillar of discipline, a man above desire, above weakness. But this old monk had lived through the parts no one spoke of. And now the truth, buried for decades in silence, was ready to be told. Long ago, when the master was still a young man, he made a choice that few ever truly make. He walked away from everything. His name, his family, his possessions, his status, all left behind like dust on a forgotten road. He wasn't escaping hardship. He was escaping comfort. Because he knew that comfort seduces. And he didn't want safety. He wanted truth. He retreated deep into the forest, far from noise, far from praise, far from anything that could distract the soul. He settled near a small village, where the only sound each morning was the wind through the trees and the heartbeat of his own breath. He owned nothing but 2 robes, a begging bowl, and a mind forged in silence. The villagers, intrigued by his stillness and touched by his dedication, began offering him food. Eventually, they built him a small bamboo hut. It was enough. He had everything, because he had nothing. And then, the rats came. They chewed through his robes. They crawled over him at night. At first, he tried to meditate through the irritation, to view them as a test of detachment. But night after night, the scratching persisted. And even the strongest mind, if disturbed long enough, will begin to crack. One morning, after yet another sleepless night, he confessed his frustration to a kind villager. The man, smiling warmly, offered a simple solution. "Take this cat," he said. "It will solve your problem." And the monk hesitated for just a second. A cat? It seemed harmless enough, logical, efficient. It wasn't luxury. It wasn't desire. It was just practical. So he accepted. The cat moved in. The rats disappeared. Peace returned. But something subtle had shifted. Something quiet, almost invisible. The moment the monk chose convenience over discomfort, control over surrender, a crack formed. Not in his walls, but in his resolve. He had always believed peace was something you became, not something you arranged. And yet, here he was, arranging it. Not with discipline, but with distraction. And though the hut was quieter, his spirit was no longer as still. Soon the cat needed milk. So the monk, once content with a single visit to the village each day, began making multiple trips, just for a little milk, just for the cat. And again, it seemed harmless. But even small deviations become habits if left unchecked. To simplify things, the villagers offered him a cow. "This way," they said. "You won't need to keep coming back. The cat will have milk, and so will you." The monk hesitated again, but accepted. It was still reasonable, still just practicality. But now the cow needed food, fresh grass, daily attention, space to graze. The monk, once still as stone, now found himself walking more, doing more, thinking more, about things he had once sworn to renounce. And then came the most subtle suggestion of all, spoken gently, offered kindly. "There's a widow in the village," they said. "She has no family. She could help you, with the cow, with the cat, with everything." It was compassion, they said. It would ease his burden. She wouldn't disturb his spiritual path. She would support it. And so, for the 3rd time, the monk allowed something into his life that he had once been willing to sacrifice everything to escape. It all still seemed innocent. A cat to chase the rats. A cow to feed the cat. A widow to help with the cow. Each decision made sense on its own. Each one felt small, logical, even kind. But that's how it always begins. Not with a fall, but with a lean. A lean into comfort. A lean into ease. A lean into something that doesn't seem dangerous until it's everywhere. And by the time you realize you're no longer walking the path, you're already living another life. The monk still told himself he was devoted. He still believed he was in control. But beneath the surface, the silence was breaking. Slowly, gently, irrevocably. And the next step wasn't a choice at all. She moved in quietly, without disruption. She brought no possessions, no expectations. She simply began helping, caring for the cow, feeding the cat, sweeping the floors of the hut. She prepared simple meals and planted vegetables near the cottage. Her presence was calm, like soft rain on dry earth. And the monk, still thinking himself untouched, let it all happen. He watched her devotion and thought, "This is not attachment. This is kindness." But slowly, without noticing, his hands began to move too. First, he helped pull weeds in the garden. Then, he carried buckets of water from the stream. Later, he joined her in the rice fields at dawn. They worked side by side in silence, and though no words were spoken, something unspoken grew between them. It wasn't sudden. It was like a vine wrapping slowly around a tree. He told himself it was compassion, service, duty. But the truth was simpler. It was connection. It was intimacy. It was something he hadn't felt since he left the world behind. And then, one day, it was love. It wasn't planned. It wasn't even acknowledged aloud. But it was real. And in time, it became something undeniable. Something living. The woman became pregnant. The monk didn't protest. He didn't leave. He simply adapted, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Because to the mind left unguarded, even the extraordinary can start to feel ordinary. The child was born during the monsoon season. The hut, once quiet and still, now echoed with laughter, crying, the clatter of bowls, the rhythm of a family. The monk no longer meditated at sunrise. He no longer sat for hours in silence or fasted for days. He woke up to the sound of his child's cry, not the birdsong of dawn. He spent his mornings working the land, feeding the animals, fetching wood, and wiping sweat from his brow. His robes were stained. His hands, once folded in prayer, were now hardened with calluses. And still, he did not question it. Not yet. Life had come slowly, like fog on the river. You don't notice when it arrives, but one day you look around and you can no longer see the other side. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of gold across the soaked rice fields, he sat down outside the hut, exhausted. His son was laughing nearby. His wife was stirring a pot over the fire. And for a fleeting moment, everything felt complete. But then he looked down at his hands, rough, weathered, cracked with labor. And something shifted. A strange silence fell over him. A deep silence. He hadn't felt it in years. And in that silence, a question surfaced. Not like a scream, but like a whisper from a life he had forgotten. What happened to me? And so the monk sat there, beneath a burning sky, beside a quiet field, holding not prayer beads, but the weight of a life he never meant to live. He had found peace once. Now he had found comfort. But deep inside, something stirred, something restless. Because when silence returns after years of noise, it doesn't whisper. It demands. He didn't regret the love. He didn't resent the life. But somewhere, buried beneath it all, was the question that never left. Was this the truth I was seeking, or the illusion I surrendered to? What he did next would define everything. His legacy, his path, his soul. But that's a story for another time. In part 2, you'll discover what happens when a man finally opens his eyes and sees how far he's drifted from himself. Will he rise again or be lost forever? Don't miss it.